Welcome to this explainer. We're diving straight into one of the most wild dynamics in human history, how the extreme, seemingly impossible environment of the Valley of Mexico literally forged the mighty Aztec Empire. We usually think of geography as just a backdrop for history, right? But here, the landscape was an active, essential player in their rise to power.
Which brings us to our core historical question for today. How exactly did the environmental conditions of the Valley of Mexico shape Aztec innovation and society? We're going to answer this by unpacking a brilliant dichotomy. Basically, how this land handed them absolutely incredible opportunities, but at the exact same time, threw some severe, existential threats their way.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the Valley of Mexico, then natural opportunities and resources, move on to the threat of the lakes, dive into Aztec engineering and innovation, and finally, wrap up by evaluating the historical evidence.
All right, Section 1, the Valley of Mexico. Let's set the scene and look at the staggering, honestly extreme geography where this empire took root.
Just look at these numbers for a second. Imagine trying to build a sprawling, thriving metropolis over 2,000 meters above sea level. And remember, they did this without modern machinery or beasts of burden. That's just the valley floor. Completely surrounding that floor are towering volcanic mountains pushing past 5,000 meters into the sky. It's like a massive, inescapable bowl. So every single drop of rain and melting snow from those peaks, it ran straight down and pooled in the valley below.
Because of that massive bowl effect, water was literally everywhere. In fact, the indigenous term for the Valley of Mexico was Anahuac, which roughly translates to the land between the waters. It wasn't just some poetic name, it was their daily reality. Water was their greatest resource, but as we're going to see, it was also one of their absolute biggest nightmares.
Moving on to Section 2, Natural Opportunities and Resources. This watery volcanic environment actually provided immense gifts that became the foundation for Aztec power.
So the valley held 5 interconnected lakes, but there was a massive catch, a crucial division. The 2 southern lakes, Chalco and Xochimilco, were freshwater, making them absolutely perfect for agriculture. But up north, totally different story. The 3 northern lakes, Saltocan, Zumpango, and the massive 60-kilometer Lake Texcoco, were salty. This single distinction is absolutely vital because it completely dictated how the Aztecs could actually use their landscape.
Beyond the water itself, this place provided an unbelievable bounty. The volcanic soil was incredibly fertile, a huge win for farming. Plus, the lakes were just teeming with fish and waterfowl for food, not to mention endless reeds that they quickly harvested for building, thatching, and weaving. They weren't just surviving out here, they were actively exploiting a gold mine of resources to build a powerhouse society.
And here's a perfect example of how geography literally translates into hard power. Obsidian. This volcanic landscape was rich in it. Because it's a super hard, brittle volcanic glass, it was the perfect material for crafting razor-sharp tools and weapons. By controlling the obsidian supply, the Aztecs scored a huge military edge over their neighbors, plus a highly valuable trade item that totally supercharged their economy.
Then there's the location of their capital, Tenochtitlan. By building their city smack in the middle of the lake, the water acted as a giant natural moat. Talk about a strategic masterpiece. It made the city incredibly tough to attack. To even get in, you had to cross these specific causeways, and the Aztecs cleverly engineered removable bridges on them. Enemy approaching? Just pull the bridges. Basically, they built an impenetrable, highly defensible fortress entirely out of water.
But of course, there's a catch. Section 3, the threat of the lakes. This incredible environmental bounty came with the severe, potentially disastrous downside. Remember that giant bowl effect we talked about earlier? Well, because the valley was essentially closed off with absolutely zero natural outlet for excess water, all that rain and snowmelt had nowhere to go. This triggered severe, terrifying seasonal flooding. The exact same water that allowed Tenochtitlan to thrive could easily rise up and just swallow the city whole.
But honestly, the sheer volume of water wasn't even the biggest danger. The real nightmare was when the massive salty Lake Texcoco flooded, pushing its saltwater south directly into the freshwater lakes. Think about it. Salt water absolutely decimates crops and destroys soil productivity. If they couldn't control this flooding, their entire food supply for thousands of people could be wiped out in a single season. Literally an existential threat.
Which leads us to Section 4, Aztec engineering and innovation. To survive these threats without modern machinery, the Aztecs pulled off some of the most brilliant engineering in history.
To figure out how to maximize farming in a world mostly made of water, they invented something called chinampas. You might have heard them called floating gardens. These were highly engineered artificial islands built straight into the shallow waters of the freshwater lakes.
They looked at an environment that seemed totally useless for large-scale farming and practically overnight transformed it into an absolute agricultural powerhouse.
And these floating farms were ridiculously productive. They allowed the Aztecs to grow staple crops right on top of the water. We are talking about massive yields of foods you probably eat today: maize, avocados, beans, tomatoes, chili peppers. By engineering a farming technique perfectly tailored to their watery world, they guaranteed a booming food supply for their massive, densely populated capital.
They didn't stop there. They turned the water into a massive asset for mobility. Instead of trying to use wheeled carts or pack animals in a swamp, they built a vast, complex network of canoes and waterways. This setup made transporting goods and communicating across the region incredibly fast and efficient. It's like they built a water-based superhighway system long before paved roads.
Okay, but what about that existential flooding problem, the saltwater threat? Well, their most massive engineering response to that can pretty much be summed up by a single number: 16.
To protect their precious freshwater chinampas, the Aztecs built an unbelievable dike that was 16 kilometers long and 20 meters wide. I mean, just picture the sheer monumental scale of that, entirely without modern equipment. This colossal wall was specifically designed to control water levels and physically block that toxic saltwater from Lake Texcoco. This wasn't just a flex of engineering muscle, it was a calculated, life-saving response to a catastrophic environmental threat.
Now, Section 5, Evaluating Historical Evidence. As students of history, we always have to ask, how do we actually know all this about their dikes and chinampas?
Well, we rely a lot on primary sources, like the letters of Hernán Cortés. In his accounts, Cortés vividly describes the environment. He notes how the valley is surrounded by high mountains, mentions the vast lakes, and specifically points out how waterways facilitated trade between cities and settlements. This is a super useful piece of evidence because it gives us a direct, first-hand European description of the Aztec environment at the absolute height of their power.
But you know the drill. We never just take a source at face value. You've got to evaluate the context. Remember your OPVL: origin, purpose, value, and limitations. The origin here is Cortés, a Spanish conquistador who eventually destroyed this very empire. That motive fundamentally shapes his purpose. He's writing back home to justify his actions to the Spanish crown and to hype up the wealth of the land. So while his account is incredibly valuable for its detailed observations, it's also highly limited by his undeniable bias and ultimate goal of conquest.
So let's tie this all together into a core historical argument. Step 1. The extreme environmental challenges of the valley, the flooding, the saltwater, basically forced action. Step 2. This intense pressure drove the Aztecs to invent brilliant technological and engineering responses, like the chinampas and that massive dike. And Step 3. These innovations did way more than just help them survive. They actually forged immense societal, military, and economic strength.
The environment of the Valley of Mexico didn't just dictate Aztec development. It was the ultimate catalyst for their innovation. They managed to turn geographic obstacles into economic gold mines and defensive fortresses. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to chew on today. If the Aztecs were pushed to such incredible heights of innovation by the very landscape that threatened them, what other great empires in human history were forged by mastering the exact forces that threatened to destroy them? Keep exploring, and I'll see you in the next explainer.